So here's your midpoint question. Do you think that nativist people have an argument about how old and new immigrants are? Okay, why or why not? Now, if by chance you started this video first, go back to video 5.1 and there you will learn about nativism. Okay, but if you have watched it, go ahead and answer the question. Do you think that the natives people have an argument about the difference between old and new immigrants? Why or why not? Justify your answer. Okay, now at the bottom is a writing prompt, just in case you don't know how to start it. It goes like, I believe that nativists don't have an argument because, and explain. Now, in the 1882, there was an act that was passed. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and based on the title alone, you should get an idea what it's about. Basically, Chinese immigrants were barred from coming into the country for 10 years. And on top of that, it prevented those Chinese people who were already here from becoming full-fledged citizens. Now, the Chinese people who already lived here, they, already set up roots. Some of them are already, had a business, they had a family, they had their life going. And then all of a sudden, the government says, no, you're not even citizens here. The thing is, they began to protest, which any citizen would, and they argued, their main argument was this: why are they being excluded, whereas Italians, Germans, and Irish are not? And if you remember the video, last video, there was a map on there, and basically, in a nutshell, the total amount of people coming from Asia into America, it was about 250,000, more or less. Whereas from Europe, it was in grand total about a 10 million. So 250,000 compared to 10 million, that's a big difference. And the thing is, all these people were on the East Coast and the Chinese were on the West Coast, where the population was, not as big, but in the East Coast, they were flooded with people. So that's what their argument was. How come they're being excluded? They petitioned to the president, and they even filed a lawsuit against the government. But the thing is, it didn't work. And when that 10 years was up in 1892, it got renewed for another 10 years. And then in 1902, once that new 10 years was over, they made it permanent. Now, in those 10 years, the population of the Chinese people dropped 30%. Again, remember, some people were already older, and then those who were young men, they basically were, in the railroads, using bombs to, dynamite, I should say, to make holes in the mountains for the railroads, things like that. Accidents happened, and some were, even killed and stuff like that. So their population dropped a significant amount. Now, here is I won't even say silver lining, but just a little fact. That Chinese Exclusion Act was finally reversed, but it wasn't until 1943, over 50 years since it was first created. So imagine, for 50 years, Chinese Americans were not allowed into our country up until World War II. And at that time, Japan was our enemy, not China. Now, many of the immigrants who lived in the East Coast area in big towns, they lived in cramped tenements. Now, you should know that word from your vocab. Okay, so I'm not going to explain it to you guys. The wealthy and the middle class people, they basically moved away from the city into the suburb areas. And then they were moving because they said, mainly because the immigrants were the reason for the rise in crime. Now, don't get me wrong, yes, there was crime in the city, but in reality, um, the crimes committed by immigrants was just about the same as those created by those who were citizens. So it wasn't like because they were there, all of a sudden the crime jumped up. No, no, no. It was about the same level as with immigrants and U.S. born people. Now, in the tenement area, you have to remember it was crammed. People, families were crammed into apartments. Some people who had room, they would, like, let's say somebody moved out, they would then rent out that room to somebody else to pay for the rent, you know. Um, and people were basically miserable. You know, they were working, they were, you know, long hours, 12, 16, 18 hours, even up to 20 hours some places. And the thing is, they had to go right back to work the next day. So they needed to, hey, let off some steam, things like that. So alcoholism grew. The other thing that made the tenement area really bad was that they had inadequate sewage disposal. They had plumbing, but the thing is, sometimes plumbing wasn't always top notch, and the landlords did not really take good care of their stuff. The supers as well. Um, all they cared about was the money, for the most part. And so when the sewage line got backed up, hey, what can we do? So people would throw their feces and other nasty body stuff into the streets. Okay. Um, and with that, the drinking water became bad and an epidemic diseases spread, because of the bad hygiene, typhoid, malaria, fever. Um, it spread like wildfire because you have to remember they're all crammed together, and if someone gets really sick in the apartment buildings, then it's going to spread like wildfire. You know. Now, as the life of these people is miserable, a new political machine starts to notice that, you know, there's some issues downtown, in the cities, and these people are basically not too happy. And they felt that they could use those people's anger to their advantage. Okay. Now, you have to remember the places that really get people elected are cities, right? Yeah, little towns here and there are good, but in cities is where a lot of people live. So they have an issue, they feel they can resolve it, and with those people will vote for them, and then um, they'll help each other out in a sense. Now, these politicians in the political machine, they promised better jobs, housing, better heating. They said, these police should be protecting you guys, and they promised this stuff. In exchange for that stuff, they said, we can't do it unless you vote for us. Now, the urban immigrant groups were a large group, okay? And they basically were like, you know what? Yeah, let's try it out. And if these guys don't deliver, well, we'll vote for somebody else. Um, and that's what they did. They came to a sort of agreement on that. Okay, so with these political bosses and political machine politicians, people elected in, the people who voted them and got what they wanted, all right? Now, at the same time, the political bosses got what they wanted. Now, many of them controlled the city finances, and that led them to commit fraud. Now, here's how this thing worked. Basically, the political bosses would basically tell these contractors, we need a road build. And let's say there was 3 companies. Okay. what these companies would do is they would make a bid. So let's say one company says we can make the street for $1 million. Another one says we can make it for $750,000, and the last one says we can make it for $500,000. And let's say it costs a little less than $500,000 to actually make the road. Okay, these guys are the lowest bidder. They should get the job because they bidded the lowest. So they're not really going for the profit. They're basically trying to build the road. These guys are trying to get profits. Now, what some contractors would do is basically say this. Let's say this guy who bid $1 million, he would then kick in, let's say $200,000 to the political boss to win the contract. So this guy gets the $1 million. Okay. Now, again, it costs a little less than $500,000, let's say, to make the road, and he spent $200,000 to give to the political boss. That's $700,000. That's $300,000 he just saved. So that's how these guys would do it, right? And it didn't just stop with the roads. It was sewers and other buildings, that needed to be built for the city. And so these political bosses would basically throw out there, hey, we need a new building built. We need a sewage line, built. We're taking bids. And then some guys would bribe the political bosses. Now, another way that these political bosses were corrupt was that they gave their friends very important jobs in the city. For example, they give them utility jobs, railway, operator jobs, waterworks operating jobs, and power system operators. So these operators are supposed to make sure that things work in line, that they work fine, that everything's in order, and things like that. But these guys were just like, they're just in for the money, to kick back and just cut the paycheck in a sense. So things weren't that well, organized. Things weren't that great, especially when you have people who don't know what they're doing in charge of important jobs. Now, one political boss who was very, very much corrupt, his name was William M. Tweed. Now, they called him Boss, all right? Now, Boss Tweed was one of the most corrupt, all right? He ran the New York Democratic political machine from the 1860s to the 1870s. And when finally he was busted, it was in 1874, he was arrested and he was put in jail, So not all of them went scot-free, okay? Now, in Kansas City, Missouri, there were these two brothers, the Pendergrass. Now, these guys basically ran the state and city politics from the 1890s up until the 1930s. And I mean, just like I mentioned before, they ran the scheme, they were corrupt, and things like that. Now, the problem is, some people were like, these guys are corrupt, these guys are bad, for us. But then there were some people who said, you know what? They're not too bad. Because here's the thing. They actually did things that the state and city government could not and would not do. They met the needs of the people. Now, yeah, they get corrupt and things like that, but they did get things done. So to them, some people, these guys weren't bad. All right, so here's your final question. Based off what you've learned, do you think that the political machine and the bosses were a good thing or a bad thing? Justify your answer. Right, and there's a writing prompt. I believe that political machines and bosses were, good thing, bad thing, because, and explain your answer. So that's the end of this lesson. So hopefully you learned something new. Don't forget, turn in this paper at the basket near the door, and I hope you guys have a good day. All right, take care, have fun.